Good evening if you're joining us from New York or Brooklyn like I am, and good morning to those of you welcoming or joining us from Southeast Asia. My name is Anne-Marie Murphy, and on behalf of the Weatherhead East Asian Institute at Columbia, the Center for Foreign Policy Studies at Seton Hall University, the New York Southeast Asian Network, and the APEC Studies Center, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on Cambodian foreign policy towards the United States. This evening's talk is part of an 8-week conference series called Southeast Asia Views America, Perceptions, Policies, and Prospects. And the series aims to assess the tenor of bilateral relations between Southeast Asia and the United States at the start of the Biden administration. As most of you know, the Biden administration has claimed that the United States is back. And in contrast to the Trump administration's unilateral and transactional America First foreign policy, President Biden has sought to assure Southeast Asian leaders of the U.S. commitment to multilateralism and renewed engagement with U.S. allies and partners. At the same time, strategic competition with China is a defining feature of Biden's foreign policy, and this has led many Southeast analysts to fear that the new administration will view Southeast Asia largely through the lens of Sino-US rivalry and pressure them to continue to choose sides. This conference series therefore features prominent Southeast Asian experts and seeks to explore the regional perspective on the opportunity and challenges for bilateral relations with the U.S. over the next 4 years. And to help us understand how Cambodia views the United States, we are extremely fortunate to have 3 of the leading experts in the field with us tonight, and it's my pleasure to introduce them now. We have 2 main presenters this evening. Dr. Vannarith Chheang is a public policy analyst and government relations strategist. He's the president of the Asian Vision Institute in Cambodia and an adjunct lecturer at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore and a visiting fellow at the ISEAS-Yusof Ishak Institute, again in Singapore. His research focuses on geopolitics and geo-economic analysis of the Mekong region. Our second presenter tonight will be Dr. Therith Lang, who is director of the Mekong Center of Strategic Studies at the Asian Vision Institute. Dr. Lang is also concurrently a visiting fellow at the Department of Political and Social Change at the Australian National University, and he joins us from Canberra tonight. Between 2006 and 2011, he worked as the bureau chief of the General Department of ASEAN Affairs at the Cambodian Ministry of International Affairs, the Cambodian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And as discussant tonight, we are extremely fortunate to have Dr. Kosal Path. Dr. Path is an associate professor of political science and chair of the master's program in international affairs and global justice at Brooklyn College. He is the survivor of the Cambodian genocide, and from 1995 to 2000, he took part in documenting the atrocities committed by the Pol Pot regime. So our 3 speakers bring a wealth of experience on the topic of U.S.-Cambodian ties, and the way we're going to proceed this evening is that Dr. Lang will begin the joint presentation on Cambodians' foreign policy towards the United States in the new era. He will speak first. He will then be followed by Dr. Chheang, and then we'll turn it over to Dr. Path for some commentary. So without further ado, Dr. Lang, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Anne-Marie Murphy, for your kind introductions. And also thank you so much for Dr. Kosal Path and other team members for your excellent arrangements. Yeah, today I would like to present some of my humble view about Cambodia foreign policy toward the United States, actually in the in historical perspective, because we will divide 2 main sections. One section will be in historical perspective, and another one by my colleague, Dr. Vannarith. He will present the contemporary one. So without further ado, I would like to show you my PowerPoint slide. Yeah, My presentation will be divided into three main parts. One, I will discuss about the Cambodian foreign policy toward the US during the from 1953 to 70, which is under our late King's father's Norodom Sihanouk's rule. And the second part is Cambodia foreign policy under the Khmer Republic from 1970 to 75. And the third one is Cambodia foreign policy under the Democratic Cambodia's rule. Don't worry, it's not gonna be too long. So I just very brief about those foreign policy strategies. Yeah. In my opinions, the Cambodia foreign policy toward the United States between 1953 to 1970, which is under our former king, the Rodam Sihanouk, can be best characterized as hedging, which consisted of, I think, 5 main elements. The first one is neutrality. The second is bandwagoning. The third one is binding engagement. The fourth one is soft balancing. And the fifth one we call open confrontation. Yeah, I'm going to explain a little bit one by one. Neutrality. Neutrality, I mean, neutral foreign policy can be evident through, I mean, his government's announcement back in December 1954. At the time, the Phnom Penh announced that Cambodia would adopt neutrality during the Cold War time, and Cambodia will continue to receive the aid from the United States and France. And at the same time, the CNU also appealed all the major power to respect Cambodian neutrality at the Bandung Conference in April 1955. This is the second evidence proving that Cambodia adopted neutrality at the very beginning of its independence from France. And at the same time, at the conference, CNU also explained the nature of Cambodia aid offered by the Americans, that this kind of aids will not jeopardize Cambodia's sovereignty, and at the same time, this kind of aid will not antagonize the communist bloc, especially China and Democratic Republic of Vietnam. At the time, Democratic Republic of Vietnam, we can call it North Vietnam, which followed the communist rule. So the CNU tried to explain all of this in order to assure that those communist bloc will not feel offended or antagonized by his decision to receive the American aid. And at the same time, he also promised that the Cambodia will opt out of CETO, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. So by doing so, the communist blocs will not feel offended. He explained this very clear to the Prime Minister of China at the time, Zhou Enlai, and also Democratic Republic of Vietnam, represented by the Pham Van Dong, if I remember correctly. Yeah. And so balancing, another element of Cambodia hedging strategy at the time is that Cambodia, CNO, has recognized the people of Republic of China in 1958. And he also, on multiple occasions, he bandwagon with the American rival, China. For example, like on one occasion in 1950s, if I remember correctly, he once said that if somebody is going to touch upon Cambodia independent sovereignty, don't worry about it. We have 650 million people of the People's Republic of China behind us. So this is something that show Cambodian, especially for soft balancing strategy toward the United States or alignment policy toward Beijing. Yeah. And the third elements of hedging strategy can be evident by, we can say it is an open confrontation elements at this point. So we have three examples here. First, CNU has rejected American aid in 1963, And then he also refused to meet the new American ambassador to Cambodia, Randolph Kita, at the time. And the worst of all was that the CNO also decided to sever, to cut off diplomatic relations with Washington in 1965. These are evidence proving that CNO has embraced the open confrontational policy or elements in his hedging policy. However, the CNO also adopt some kind of positive approach toward the United States too, as evident by his adoption of binding engagement with the United States. The first example is that in 1968, you can see that the Phnom Penh tried to engage with Washington by welcome the U.S. Ambassador Chester Bowles' visit to Cambodia. He was the ambassador to India at the time. This is paving the way to the normalization of relation between Cambodia and the U.S. In 1969. Phnom Penh fully restored its diplomatic ties with Washington. And the last element of CNO's foreign policy hedging strategy was that you can see that CNO have once said that he will keep his eyes shut if American pursue the Viet Cong, which is the communist forces from North Vietnam, who operated in Cambodia. So he will keep his eyes shut if American pursue this Viet Cong inside the Cambodian territory, but only inside the we call underpopulated areas only. Yeah, this paved the way. Paved the way for the Americans to fight against the communist forces. Who at the time, the war in Vietnam also escalated. So the Viet Congs, operated quite extensively, start to penetrate into Cambodia, and this is the reason why it caused a lot of concern to the Americans. And you might question what are the factors influence the decision-making policy of CNO. I think I don't have time to go through all of the factors, so I would just view only one angle of the factors that influence foreign policy, decision-making foreign policy at that time, which is from we call decision-making level, because we have according to John Spanier, we have three levels of foreign policy analysis. One is the decision-making level. Second is the nation-state level, and the last one is systemic level. So we can view each decision-making from the three angles, but I cannot go through all the three angles. So I will touch upon only decision-making level. Mostly focusing on decision-making structure and personality of the leaders per se. Yeah. So you can see why CNO adopted the hedging strategy. So which composed of different elements. First of all, you can see CNO neutrality was mainly influenced by his competition with his other political party, especially the Precision Party and Democrat Party at the time. That's why he adopted neutrality. Precision Party was known to be we call pro-Vietnamese communist. Yeah. Whereas the Democrat was known to be anti-communist. So the CNO has to adopt somewhere in between in order to, placate, in order to, to make them happy, both of them happy, so that they will not challenge his power. And however, in 1958, CNO foreign policy strategy begins switching back and forth, especially as I mentioned earlier. He started adopting other different elements like bandwagoning and also soft balancing, binding engagement, so on and so forth in his foreign policy toward the US. Because there has been some kind of uh, his decision-making level. I mean, at the decision-making structure, especially the precision, his rival, also starting putting pressure on him. And on the right wing, we have the military represented by Lundnall. The military wings, sorry, the right wing was not really happy with Sihanouk when he decided to cut off the American aid or even the diplomatic relation with the U.S. because the U.S. at the time offer like substantial aid to the military. As well as I know, it's about 30% of the aid offered uh, to to the military. 30% of the Americans, and 30% are from the United States. That's why when Sihanouk decided to stop the aid from America, the right wing was not very happy with him. That's why he tried to find his way out of this by trying to, also to please those his right wing as well. And at the same time, the Precision and especially the Communist Party inside Cambodia also grew stronger. Especially there was some evidence proving that the Precision Party has sided closely with the Vietnamese communists. They even received the direction from the Vietnamese communists. That's why he feel like he received. He was also threatened by the Vietnamese community too. That's why the Sihanouk also, paved the way for he tried to bandwagon with the U.S. rival, which was North Vietnam at that time, by allowing the Viet Cong to base in Cambodia. Yeah, and another, I think, factor which is within the decision-making level, which shaped the Sihanouk's foreign policy toward the U.S. at the time is it involved the Sihanouk personalities, I believe. Sihanouk's, he was kind of leader who's very pragmatic. He has a very pragmatic view of the global politics, and he's always adaptable to changing circumstances. That's why he always, his foreign policy elements, he adopted the various foreign policy elements in relation to the United States, as I already mentioned. Yeah. Now we come to the second part, which is the foreign policy of Cambodia toward the United States during the Khmer Republic rule, 1970 and 75. During this time, the Cambodians, unlike Sihanouk's, Lon who was the ruler of Cambodia at that time, he totally aligned with the United States. As evident by first of all is in April in 1970, Lon publicly announced that he accepted the foreign assistance from the United States. In this case, as I quoted here, the external assistance here means that mostly is from the United States. And the second evidence is that during the visit by U.S. Vice President Spiro Agnew to Phnom Penh in 1973, Lon was asked to share power with his political rival Intam and Seremata, this is American pressure or American suggestion. American want him to share power with his two domestic rivals, and he agreed. Ridiculously, Seremata once asked Lon why he agreed to share the power with him, and Lon said that this is because our foreign friends want him to do that. The foreign friends here refer to the Americans. And the last one is that Lon government even backed the U.S. bombing of Cambodia, although it caused severe scarcity among Cambodians. It was estimated that between 150,000 to 750,000 casualties were caused by American bombing of Cambodia between 1970 to 1975. So, but London still supported Americans bombing. This act proved the Cambodia's bandwagoning with the United States, which is the policy adopted by the Khmer Republic at that time. And the factor influenced the London foreign policy toward the U.S. at the time. I think there were two main factors. The first one is that the London himself, he wanted to counter he wanted the Americans support him to fight against his domestic rival, especially CNO and the Communist Party of Cambodia, which grown stronger day by day. As you know, that the Lundnall, it was the one who staged the coup against CNO in 1970. And that's why CNO has appealed to all Cambodian citizens to join side with the Communist Party of Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge, in order to topple Lundnall at the time. It was estimated that, like at the beginning, the forces of the Communist Party of Cambodia was about only 3,000, but after Sihanouk's appeal, it seemed like the forces grew to the about 30,000. Yeah, and also within this decision-making structure, I can see that the Lundnall government, the reason why the Lundnall government adopted the we call total alignment policy with the U.S. because Lundnall also wanted the American to fit his corrupted government as well, because it's there was a lot of evidence. A lot of newspaper circulated at the time, stating that Lundnall government is very corrupted. There's they some of the newspapers said that some of his military officers even sold the ammunition and others logistic to the Communist Party of Cambodia also. So this is very ridiculous. Yeah. And in terms of personality, Lundnall is the worst kind of leader who lacked of vision, who lacked a pragmatic view of the world politics. He was not like Sihanouk. That's why this kind of we call personality has influenced a lot in his foreign policy toward the United States, because some people say that he believed even in the magic we call the occult science, in the magic thing. So he was not a pragmatic leaders like Sihanouk. Oh, sorry. And the last but not least, is the Khmer Rouge or Democratic Cambodia foreign policy toward the United States. There was, in my observation, there was a very little evidence, especially the literature written about Cambodia or Democratic Cambodia foreign policy toward the U.S. But in my very humble research, I believe that the Khmer Rouge or the Democratic Cambodia has adopted the hard balancing toward the United States. As I can see that, first of all, the Democratic Cambodia has on multiple occasions tried to create military alliance with China. Yeah. So Democratic Cambodia leaders have visited China on multiple occasions in 1977. I think they must have some kind of military arrangement with China, especially ask for China military support from China. Yeah. And the second, I think, the second evidence proving that the Democratic Cambodia adopted the hard balancing can be seen in the Maya incident in 1975, where the Khmer Rouge forces has attacked the Actually, first of all, the Khmer Rouge has seized the commercial vessel of the U.S., and then it prompted the American, retaliation. And after that, the boat has classes, and the class resulted in the some casualty on the American side as well. 3 helicopter of the U.S. was destroyed by the Khmer Rouge in Koh Tang. Yeah, and these are the some evidence proving the um, Democratic Cambodia embrace of the hard balancing foreign policy strategy toward the United States. And I think in terms of factors, what factor influencing the Khmer Rouge foreign policy approach toward the U.S., in my opinion, there were 2 factors. The first one is that in terms of, you know, uh, in terms of I mean the Khmer Rouge leadership structure, you can see why the Khmer Rouge decided, to confront United States militarily, even it's was much weaker compared to the U.S. I believe that this was because of the loose structure of the leadership organization of the Khmer Rouge. Um, According to some research, the Khmer Rouge, the Democratic Cambodia at the time was divided into 6 zones, 6 administrative zones. And this 6 zone even can be divided into the small subzone. It's about 32 subzones. So this kind of, so there was no consistent coordination between, between those Khmer Rouge leaders in each zone. So I think the decision to go, to confront the U.S. militarily was not actually coming from the central government. Perhaps it's the decision of the commander in the field. Yeah, and another factors that we should consider here is that the Khmer Rouge leader personality, especially Pol Pot, is very interesting too. Why he decided to confront the U.S. So uh, some of the evidence suggested that the Pol Pot was very hyper chauvinistic. He's too patriotic that he believed that the Khmer people can do anything. Yeah. Though, according to the one historian, famous historian on Cambodia, Michael Vickery, he said Pol Pot believed that once said that if the Khmer can build, Angkor Wat, which is very one of the most famous wonder in the world. So the Khmer people could do anything, including fighting the Americans. I think because of this, perhaps it's influenced his decision to, to confront the United States militarily. Yeah, I think my presentation came to an end now, and I leave this to my colleagues, Dr. Vannarith, who will present the contemporary Cambodia foreign policy. At the same time, I just would like to stress that why I didn't mention the Cambodia foreign policy toward the US during 1979 up to 1993, because at this point in time, Cambodia was not independent. In 1979 to 89, Cambodia was still under occupation of the Vietnamese. And from 89 and 93, Cambodia was under the UN supervision. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Thirat. I just would like to add from the 1993 to present and the future, look at the future US-Cambodia relationship. First, I agree that maybe some may challenge this, that hedging strategy continues and fluctuates, of course, fluctuate over times since 1993 until now, even going to the future. But the factors that really define the effectiveness of hedging strategy of Cambodia depends on internal factors. So I think the internal factor defined the external relation of Cambodia. That's why domestic politics really matters. So the failure of hedging, not the failure, but the weakness of hedging of Cambodia during Sihanouk time was really about the domestic divisions. Communist Party, right wing, left wing, so the lack of national unity at that time. Even though he tried to be neutral and tried to hedge against major power, but the effectiveness was constrained. The same thing, Cambodia in the 1990s, Cambodia is still divided, still weak in terms of nation building, state building. So, so that foreign policy also in terms of diversifications and forging partnership with external partner also somehow constrained. From at the turn of the century into the new millennium, we can see the power consolidation of the Cambodian People Party under the leadership of Prime Minister Hun Sen. So that kind of the domestic politics somehow become kind of a source of strength for the external relations. And then, unfortunately, the power competition between the two political parties, the ruling and the opposition, really challenged the dynamics of foreign policy after the 2013 elections. So 2013 election was a watershed elections in which the opposition party gained significant votes and seats at the National Assembly and posed a serious threat, existence of threat to the ruling Cambodian People parties. So that, create this kind of attention between Cambodia and the US, because the US, from the ruling party perspective, was behind the opposition party. So in a few years later, 2017, the leaders of opposition party was arrested and the main opposition party was dissolved. And the main reason for that is the intentions, the alleged intentions to carry out color revolutions and also link the US with that color revolution in Cambodia. And from the US perspective, started to the strategic thinkers and policymakers started to think that Cambodia became a client state and a vassal state of China, and using various kind of accusation or rumors, but we don't have clear evidence with regard to the naval base of China in Sihanouk and Koh Kong, for instance. So that is a challenge of hedging because of this serious lack of strategic trust between the two countries that limit the space for Cambodia to expand its relation with the US and for the US to deepen or engage in Cambodia and the region at large. So US-Cambodia relation in the new era, they need to overcome this perception gap, serious perception gap. First, Cambodia need to modify or revisit its perception that the US seek regime change in Cambodia, especially through color revolutions. And the US need to change its perception that Cambodia is a client or vassal state of China. If these two perceptions still exist, I don't think US-Cambodia relation will be stable or smooth down the road. Second, Cambodia is trying to hedge by building close relations with the US allies, especially Japan, South Korea, Australia. So those are the three countries, US allies, that Cambodia has built very close political, security, and economic relations with the US ally. So that is a sign of hedging strategy in the new context, not directly with the US, but with the US allies in these regions. It's not easy. I mean, for other countries, they may build relation with the US first, and then from the US to the US allies, you know, kind of hierarchical power structure. But Cambodia is different because of the lack of trust with the US. That's why Cambodia need to diversify to the US friends and allies in the region for its hedging strategy. I think Prime Minister himself, at the personality level and the personal leadership level, he's so much inspired by Prince or King Sihanouk in terms of foreign policy. So I think some of the key elements that King Sihanouk used to apply will be part of his worldview. So that's why a historical evidence, historical memories really matter in Cambodia to understand Cambodian foreign policies. And we need to understand also throughout the Cambodian history, after the collapse of the Khmer Empire, foreign interference is essential threat, especially from the two big neighbors. And so Cambodia, throughout the history, sought external power to support its independence and sovereignty from France, China, and the United States. So at least three, right, to support its sovereignty. So when dealing with the US in the early stage, as Kirit mentioned, he always stressed on borders, asked the US to please recognize our borders, because we don't have a border demarcation. Even until now, we don't have complete border demarcation with our neighboring country yet. With Vietnam, 86%. And maritime boundary even more challenging, how to demark the maritime boundaries with Thailand and Vietnam. We don't have clear. So this sovereignty issue, territorial integrity, will remain the key determinant of Cambodian foreign policy toward external powers. Who can protect Cambodia's sovereignty and independence? That is something that perhaps Prime Minister Hun Sen would to seek the clear signal from the Joe Biden administration to clarify that the US will support Cambodia in terms of independence, sovereignties, and also need to send a clear signal that the US doesn't seek regime change in Cambodia. Because Donald Trump sent several letters, so it seemed to be a great signal that Phnom Penh really happy, satisfied with that letters, especially the word not seek regime change. So that is something that Joe Biden perhaps need to reiterate that US position. So that is perhaps the most fundamental approach in order for these two countries to have a better bilateral relationship. Last point is relating to economic and soft power issues. So economic relations between US and Cambodia have been growing quite remarkably, especially before the COVID-19. So the bilateral trade, about $6 billion and US is the main market, key market for Cambodia exports. In terms of FDI, the US has invested more than $1 billion to Cambodian market, and growing US company are interested in Cambodian market. And Cambodia can be production based because Cambodia have signed a free trade agreement with China. So Cambodia can be a a very fertile ground for the US company to produce its goods and products and export to China. And also concluded with South Korea in terms of FTA and the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, will make Cambodia more attractive to the US companies. Soft power, human rights, democracy remain stumbling blocks, different, even divergent interpretation, implementation of human rights democracies. And we understand that Joe Biden will stick to this core principle of American or values, or this kind of so-called universal values, human rights and democracies. So how to reconcile the differences with regarding to these two issues, human rights, democracy? I believe that more frank and open dialogue between the US and Cambodia will help. I think the door remains open to have more dialogue on this. And Cambodia understand that social justice, democracy, human rights are critical to peace and prosperity of Cambodia. So that, I think, the room open and the gap can be reduced with regard to human rights and democracies. So I would like to end my intervention here, and thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to ask Kosel Path for his commentary, and I want to remind the audience that there will be Q&A afterwards. The Q&A function is open, so please put your questions there. Thank you.
Thank you for Dr. Chheang's and Dr. Ling's presentations, taking us back to the history of Cambodia foreign policy from Sihanouk's to Lon Nol to Pol Pot and to the current Prime Minister Hun Sen's foreign policy strategy toward great powers. I'm going to make three. My commentary will touch on three points. One is the implication, the broader implication of the strategic, I would say, comprehensive rivalry between the United States and China. And number two, on the foreign policy decision making that both presenters talked about. And number three, I think want to extend the discussion to the conceptual and theoretical discussions about the concept of hedging, bandwagoning, balancing. So it's a lot of concepts being thrown out there, but I think we need to clarify that. So those are the 3 points I will go over, and then each one I will pose some questions as well. So Cambodia it's part of Southeast Asia, is part of ASEAN. So it's sort of a sub-regional grouping itself. And so I think we haven't heard a lot about the ASEAN, so I'm going to touch on that. Right, so in terms of Dr. Ling talked about the 3 levels of analysis. Now I'm going to talk about the first is the strategic rivalry between the United States and China, and that is sort of the kind of systemic pressure on ASEAN in general and Cambodia in particular. So what are the specific features of this Sino-American comprehensive, competition? So there was, ASEAN is no stranger to rivalry. Cambodia is no stranger to great power rivalry and interference in the past, but this is quite different. In the 21st century, we are seeing the Sino-American competition become more comprehensive. So on the military, defense level, economic relation, trade, and number 3, ideology, values, and number 4, the presenter talked about soft power. Number 5, diplomacy, science, and technology. So these are comprehensive types of competitions between the 2 superpowers, right? And I would say that the first 3, the military, economic, and ideology, I think will have major consequences on Southeast Asia in general and Cambodia in particular. And you mentioned some of that. Dr. Chheang mentioned about, the Cambodia basically already felt the competition in terms of the security and military side of this competition, and that is the Ream Naval Base, Darasako Airport, right? This is the questions of military base, the dual use of economic and military base, and the sort of accusations being thrown out on both sides. So that's just, we're seeing the effects of that intensify rivalry between China and the United States. So we can be sure that Americans' relative capability remains strong and deep in Southeast Asia since the World War II, right? American hub and spoke system, alliance with the Philippines, with Thailand, now closer military cooperation with Vietnam. So these are the countries that the president talked about. These are neighbors of Cambodia. They became a lot closer to the United States, including Vietnam, the former enemy of the United States, not to mention the Philippines and Singapore, strategic relationship with the United States. So there's no question that American relative capability remains strong, remain deep, remain entrenched in Southeast Asia, and we have to be clear-eyed about it. Many Southeast Asian countries still view the United States as an offshore balancer, is a force to balance against China. But we also have to recognize that Chinese influence is rising rapidly and fast, and has the potential to undercut Americans' interests across the board in Southeast Asia. So these systemic rivalry and comprehensive competition produce both opportunities and constraints for Southeast Asia in general and Cambodia in particular. And the first one, this rivalry would provide opportunity for ASEAN states to play one great power, United States or China, off against another great power. And Cambodia can do that. And if you don't have to look far beyond Cambodia border, just look at Thailand and Vietnam. They are the masters of maintaining diversified relationship with external power. Vietnam has a relationship with India, Russia, including military relationship with Russia and closer relations with the United States. But at the same time, economically, Vietnam still have enormous economic relation with China in terms of ideology, right? It's a one-party state. So you have party-to-party relations, closer party-party relation as well. And so on Thailand, we all know that Thailand is one of the Southeast Asian countries that has been able to successfully stay out of avoid being colonized by great powers and be able to maintain independence, and it's the masters of hedging diplomacy, you will, right? And so you have both neighboring countries very good at that, right? And then you have this, what Dr. Chheang talked about, the hierarchical structure in the sort of sub-Asia Pacific, East and Southeast Asia. You have middle powers like South Korea, Australia, Japan, that Dr. Chheang talked about, and Cambodia had close relationship with South Korea in the Japan, Australia, and Cambodia also in the process of in kind of signing a sort of free trade agreement with South Korea. And that is just a case in point. And on top of that, there's another layers in this hierarchical power structure. That is India. India is, again, it's an emerging power. And India's Act East policy under Modi is a step toward engaging Asia in a much more strategic sense in competition with China as well. And so within this hierarchical structure, small state, small powers, Southeast Asia in general has enormous opportunity to hedge against, doesn't have to be, bandwagon with any particular power or United States or China, or doesn't have to hedge again or balance against China or United States either. So a lot of opportunities, especially when you see in the economic sector that you talked about, right? So you see that our Southeast Asian countries have been able to successfully to take advantage of that, having economic relation with China, but at the same time, close economic relation with United States. If I'm not mistaken, Southeast Asia is the fourth largest trading partner of the United States. And the Biden administration is committed to that. And this is going back to the Obama administration. So we expect that the Biden administration will continue that to engage Asia in terms of trade and security as well. Third, no question, ASEAN continue to have quite great agency, a lot of agency. All ASEAN member states share post-colonial identities against foreign power intervention. So like Cambodia, many Southeast Asian countries embrace this kind of post-colonial identity, and they don't want United States and China to dictate what they have to do, right? So that's the ASEAN, the concept of ASEAN centrality, the ASEAN way, the ASEAN norms of non-intervention, and which Cambodia can resonate and be part of it. So my first question to both of you is, why has Cambodia not been able to do a lot of strategic hedging? Yes, you talk about hedging, but not a lot of hedging, strategic hedging. Instead, Cambodian leaders have been very enthusiastic about Cambodia becoming China's closest allies and collaborator. So Dr. Chin talked about that there's some hedging, but not a lot, right? Not a lot. So why other countries like Vietnam and Thailand have been able to do that and Cambodia has not? Is bandwagoning with China itself a Cambodia grand strategy? The constraint, let's talk about the constraint. As Chinese influence over Cambodia continue to grow, and we expect to grow, China may demand for Cambodia to side with China on major foreign policy decisions, especially a decision that has to do with China core interests like the South China Sea. So this would make it very difficult for Cambodia to maintain its self-proclaimed neutrality, right? So neutralism, you cannot just say it, you got to do it in practice. So as China influence continue to grow, this might be difficult going forward. So Dr. Chin talked about this, that there's some critics of the government and some political scientists like David Schomburg recently go so far to describe Cambodia as a virtual client state of China, right? In his later books, where great powers meet, America, China in Southeast Asia. So this is not just some critic, but some scholar even use the term client state to describe Cambodia relation with China, right? But I, for one, agree with both of you that Cambodia still has a lot of agency and it doesn't want to be anybody client state. Because I've talked to a number of people inside the government that they're talking about that they want Cambodia to be able to shape its foreign policy, to shape its course and its own vision. So I agree with you on that. But the question remains. This is my second question. In your view, has China compromised Cambodia independence and agency in its foreign policy, as some critics have alleged? If not, then the question becomes, what are Cambodia's long-term strategy to maintain neutrality in its foreign policy, which is very necessary to construct a strategic hedging approach in the context of intensified, comprehensive competition between China and the United States? How Cambodia can utilize its chairmanship next year to engage the United States and China in favor of its ASEAN centrality and Cambodian neutrality at the same time? So that's a big question, I think. Now, number two, I'm going to the making of Cambodia foreign policy. Of course, you mentioned about leaders matter, right? And of course, leaders matter in any country foreign policy, and much more so in a small state like Cambodia. Prime Minister Hun Sen, you talked about this, and I agree to some extent that he is a pragmatist and a realist, similar to King Sihanouk. He's a pragmatist and a realist. Just look at recent history, his story. He defected from the Khmer Rouge in June 1977 to seek Vietnamese help to form an anti-Pol Pot front. Again, remember the Vietnamese were just a couple of years before were the enemy he fought against, right? And then he became the foreign minister and then prime minister of the People's Republic of Cambodia under the Vietnamese occupation. In the span of just 5 years, he moved from foreign minister to become the prime minister in 1985. Then he became the closest allies of the People's Republic of China in from 2010 forward in particular. And so he used to call the Chinese reactionary expansionists in the 80s, right? So just a brief look at the history itself, she clearly showed the Prime Minister Hun Sen is a pragmatist and a realist. And that is my view. And I think I agree with you on that. But I think there's an implication of being pragmatist and realist. As you have shown, Dr. Leng and Dr. Chien, that throughout history, a leader that professes pragmatist foreign policy tends to do better than as you described, total alignment with an external power. So that seemed to be the lesson learned from history, right? And so that I think is very important to take note of Prime Minister Hun Sen. He is not committed to any ideological alignment with that of China or any other, or Vietnamese for that matter. So he can switch back and forth for his his loyalty is to Cambodian national interest and also the ruling party staying in power, right? And so I have a chance to talk with some insider who have told me that they are not too worried about Cambodia dependence on China, because Prime Minister Hun Sen is not committed to an ideology, a Chinese ideology. He is more pragmatic, more transactional in the pursuit of economic interest, because Cambodian economic development. So this is about money, this is not just about transactional, and that is his operational code. And so my third question is, to what extent do you think the Prime Minister Hun Sen, pragmatist and really thinking, allow Cambodia foreign policy to be more flexible, agile, and perhaps, as you described, proactive in maximizing benefit from both China and the United States going forward, while adapting traditional hedging strategy from Sihanouk era to keep both power at bay, therefore maintain Cambodia's independence? You also stressed the importance of domestic politics, and I think that this is something that I'd like to know more. What are the role of domestic politics in Cambodia foreign policy in the past, but I'm more concerned about what the role of domestic politics in Cambodia today. And especially nationalism, Cambodian nationalism. And now you see anti-China, anti-Vietnamese kind of brewing in Cambodian society. And during the COVID time, anti-China sentiment, resentment has been brewing as well under the surface of Cambodian society. So what are the role of domestic politics today that might, like, if you can tell us what are the particular feature, but the most important domestic factors that influence Prime Minister Hun Sen government's foreign policy going forward. And I would add another question to that: is this Cambodia foreign policy, has Cambodia foreign policy decision-making changed in the past couple of years? Because we've seen some signs of change, meaning the kind of great man theories tend to kind of open up the way for more input from, people like yourself, experts, and also the younger generation input into Cambodia foreign policy. So that would be, I think, very important for scholars to know that Cambodia is no longer a one man's affair. It's become more moving toward embracing inputs from professional, from sort of the kind of knowledge base of foreign policy decision making. So become more professionalized, become more diverse in a sense. Then I have this sort of conceptual, this is sort of for me, is sort of the most important to me, important point to me is the question of conceptual discussion. Dr. Lay described the concept of hedging during the Sihanouk era in a way pretty much can be described as hedging, right? So he described hedging would include soft balancing, open confrontational alignment. So everything seemed to be put into this one basket as hedging. But my understanding of hedging is this, is part of sort of a kind of a spectrum. You have bandwagoning, and then you have, hedging in the middle, and then you have balancing toward the end. And in between you have soft and hard balancing, soft bandwagoning and so forth. So conceptually it's a bit confusing in the sense that, to me, I think when we talk about hedging, it requires the state, the actor, to have some neutrality. So because if you don't have neutrality, you cannot hedge, because you basically moving toward bandwagoning or toward balancing. So in terms of the concept, I like you to think about conceptual clarity when you use the word hedging here as a framework. Then I have a much broader questions about the literature in international relations, especially over the past decades, beginning with David Kang's books, Eat Before West. Basically he revived the ancient Chinese concept of tributary system. Basically it's a China-centered hierarchical order where the relationship between China and the neighboring tributary small state are very hierarchical, very peaceful, non-coercive, highly deferential. I studied Vietnam-China relation, so I've written and published about this. And so my question is all these Western concepts of international relation, like you use, like balancing, bandwagoning, alliance, do these Western concepts fail to capture what I am talking about, the phenomenon I'm talking about, in the sense of China's relation with neighboring small states like Cambodia, Vietnam? It's much more consistent with Chinese understanding of tributary system in the past. So what is the relevance of this concept today? But for example, when I speak about that, I think about in terms of when Prime Minister Hun Sen took his son, Hun Vannarith, to see President Xi Jinping, the middle of the COVID. So there's a lot, what I'm trying to get at is that a lot more personal, a lot non-coercive, more of a deferential, right? Respect. It seemed to me that this sort of concept bandwagoning, balancings and hedging failed to capture this kind of a sort of Asian relations understanding of diplomacies and relationship. So in a way, the relationship between Cambodia and China cannot be described as an alliance because there's no formal alliance. And the Chinese do not believe in formal alliance. I study Vietnam-China relations, but the Chinese never signed any formal alliance with the North Vietnamese. And yet the Chinese sent over 300,000 Chinese troops to defend North Vietnam in the war resisting the United States between 1965 and 1973. So my point is that these concepts seem to be very formalized, seem to be sort of rooted in Western understanding of formal alliances. You have to sign an agreement and defense the military cooperation, but the Chinese relations with Cambodia in particular and other Southeast Asia in particular seem to be consistent with the tributary system in the past. So I like your thought on that as well. So I think my time is up, so I have more questions. I'm sure the audience will have more questions as well, so I'm going to end here. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Wow, that was really comprehensive. So we got about 20 minutes left. I'm not sure how we want to proceed. Actually, a lot of your questions were fascinating, Kosal. Why can't Cambodia seem to maneuver between great powers as well as Thailand and Vietnam? Does Cambodia need to support China's core interest, and are they constrained? Is Hun Sen a pragmatist? I mean, out of your very thoughtful, analytical, theoretical questions, those were kind of the three main ones. Since we do have a lot of questions, and I actually had a couple, I don't know if we want to take maybe 2 or 3 minutes or just a few minutes, and one of you can respond to each one of those questions, and we can come back to some of those in the book project. Would that be okay, Vannarith or Terith? Do you want to take a minute or so for those questions?
Thank you, Dr. Professor Kosal. Very interesting and very useful questions for our book chapter, and we will consider integrating those points in our book chapter and also paper article. And really grateful for that. So okay, I guess a quick response to why Cambodia could not pursue a hedging strategy, something similar to Thailand and Vietnam, two neighboring countries. First, come to the perception again that the US and the West, from the Cambodian ruling perspective, treated Cambodia differently or even have double standards. Vietnam is a communist regime, but human rights, democracy are not a constraint in the US-Vietnam relation and US or Vietnam-EU relation. Even they signed FTA with the European Union. So comparing democracy, human rights between Cambodia and Vietnam, I think it's not that, that clear from the Cambodian perspective why the US and the West provide a strategic privilege and economic privilege to Vietnam. Second, Thailand democracy, human rights also has a problem after the military coup, several military coups, right? So why the US and the West did not punish Thailand, but Cambodia was punished by the European Union because of everything but arms. They removed already 20%, and the US is not yet responsive to the GSP yet to the Cambodian and other recipient of GSP. So this double standard or even triple standard, I think we need to clear the cloud because I think perception really matters. So that really constrained, even Cambodia have good intention and interest to engage the US and Europe, but this kind of treatment, double standard, really constrained this kind of the ability to maneuver this kind of strategic space. So Hun Sen is pragmatic. Yes, I can confirm it, and he is flexible and pragmatic. And as Dr. Kusal mentioned, that it's a growing consensus among Cambodian ruling elites that economic security is national security. So economic interests come first in its external relation, especially with major powers. And who can offer economic incentive to Cambodia from infrastructure development, trade, investment, development assistance, that will matter. And within the context of COVID-19, in terms of vaccines and medical supplies, it seems that China have gained additional ground in Cambodia and in Southeast Asia. And the US seem to be absent from this support to Southeast Asia when it comes to vaccines, medical supplies, support, and others. So that is the dynamics. It's ongoing that really somehow do not give space. So for hedging, for small state to exercise hedging effectively, the bigger power need to provide them some space. Without space, it's difficult for them to exercise hedging strategy. So it's a two-way street, two-way communication. So the major power need to understand that small state needs space to breathe. So Cambodia needs space now. So that is the message, I think, for the US, is to provide more space for Cambodia.
I just would like to add a little bit to what Dr. Vannarith just mentioned about Cambodia hedging strategy. Why we cannot adopt majorly the hedging strategy? What are the constraints of the Cambodian adoption of hedging strategy toward the United States? It's not only totally dependent on the United States or other major power per se, but also dependent on the internal strengths of Cambodia, especially economic strengths of Cambodia. In order to, like Switzerland or others, a small country in Europe, they have the strength, economic strength, military strength to adopt their, in order that their hedging can be operational in a way that maximize their interests. But Cambodia, in terms of economics and military, is very weak, and much weaker than Thailand, much weaker than Vietnam. That's why in the eye of the United States, perhaps because Cambodia is not too important. Like Vietnam defeated the US. So Vietnam make the American know who the Vietnamese is. So for Cambodia, we're too weak. At this point, because of this point, I think perhaps Cambodia tend to be overlooked by major power. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I guess I wanted to follow up before we open it to Q&A, and we do have some great questions. Both of you mentioned the base, and you mentioned that as a key issue of trust, right? That for the US to improve relations with Cambodia, they have to trust that Hun Sen and other leaders will ensure Cambodia's control over the base, et cetera. You indicated that there is no proof of the document, right? Of the two agreeing to that. As you know, Congress passed a law, or in the Appropriations of Aid Act, that the Secretary of State, so Anthony Blinken, has to certify that Cambodia has maintained control over the base, and the base will be open. And as you quote in your paper, the Prime Minister has said that this base, yes, it is being financed with mostly Chinese money. They welcome other finance, and the base will be open to other countries. Are you worried about this certification of the base that Secretary Blinken must make for the rest of the aid to Cambodia to go forward? Do you think that is kind of a litmus test for the trust that you say is so lacking, both because that's the China issue? I mean, the regime change, it's kind of easy to write a letter like Trump did, right? So could you give me a little sense of the concern there? And as a kind of secondary question, could you just give me a sense of exactly where the anti-American sentiment that is mobilized, for example, against the opposition leaders in 2017, right, against Kem Sokha and others when they were accused of being lackeys of the United States, and Cambodia closed the National Democratic Institute. Obviously, the history of the bombing, the history of Vietnam War, there's so much history, right, that you can mobilize against the United States. But does Hun Sen do that the way anti-Vietnamese sentiment has been mobilized? Or is it a result of more current pressure on the human rights and democracy issues that have been so divisive? If you could just speak, either one of you, about those issues, I'd really like to know a little more. Thank you.
Okay. On the kind of alleged naval base, China naval base in Cambodia, well, I think if the US can provide evidence, that would be helpful, because as a scholar, we would like to see as well, either it is a confidential report or evidence to show clearly that actually there's a military base, a Chinese military base or naval base in Cambodia. It will be helpful for us as an observer. That's something that we would like the US to show, I mean, to the public about this. Second is a Cambodian narrative from the government. It has been clear that it would be open to different countries, especially when it comes to the Ream base. So that is kind of clear position. If the Cambodia doesn't receive any foreign vessels, then we can accuse Cambodian government that you are exclusive, you don't respect your words. This is the Prime Minister's words, right? So we can hold the Cambodian government accountable for that. Let's try, send more ships to Cambodian port, whether the authority receive those foreign vessels or not, for the US, Australia, Japan, or India. If they refuse, then something wrong. Then something wrong. Then that is a clear signal that, okay, the port are exclusive right for the Chinese only, right? So that, I think something, transparency really matters here. So both sides, the US, Cambodian government, need to reveal what they have in their hands and promote transparency. So I think this would have reduced the misunderstanding and trust.
Anything on the source of anti-Americanism?
Thierry, I can comment on that, the source of anti-Americanism.
Oh, I thought that Dr. Gasol want to add something.
Yeah, but I'm not allowed. Can I say very quick?
Oh,
go ahead.
Okay, yes, please.
Because I think Dr. Chheang just said something that really got kind of going back to my point about this sort of Americans' Western understanding of alliance, very exclusive. So if you sign an alliance with Thailand, you're exclusive. You have to be exclusive. But I think Cambodia doesn't think in terms of exclusiveness. I think Cambodia think of being inclusive. I think there may be something about this that may be a topic that need to be studied furthermore, because the Western understand when you sign an alliance with a country, you expect exclusive, right? Exclusive relationship. You can't have to be loyal. You have to be 100%. But I think Cambodia cannot afford to be exclusive in a sense. So just a remark.
Right. Well, and as you noted, with the tributary system, it wasn't exclusive, right? Cambodian had ties with Vietnamese, Thailand, and then up to the Chinese, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes, and the Vietnamese set up its own tributary system with smaller countries like Champa and Cambodia. So it is a bigger topic.
Okay. Thierry, would you like to jump in on the anti-Americanism?
Yeah, Let me share my humble thought about the anti-American sentiments in Cambodia. I would say in general, like in terms of Cambodian sentiments, is positive, quite positive toward the United States. But like the history cannot be forgotten. But it's there. It's a problem. Is there already. So if it just happened something to ignite it, and then it will happen again. So that means if United States like put pressure on it, and then it will revitalize those things coming out again. Then Cambodia, for example, Cambodia asked the United States to forgive its debt for in the 1970s, and America said, no, I don't want to. I will not forgive you for this. You have to pay the debt. But those debt, you have to understand, those debt is used by Lon Nol, again Cambodian per se. So that that revoke, that revitalized the sentiment, American sentiment, anti-American sentiment, because it reminds people about the past war that Cambodia suffered. But if nobody mentioned about this, maybe Cambodian generally would view positively toward Americans. Yeah.
Okay. We have quite a number of questions. One of them is on the upcoming Cambodian chairmanship of ASEAN next year and how that might fit into US-Cambodian relations. So I will put that out there. And one of the questions that I would like to add on top of the question that was posted by Henry Ong is, how does the current Myanmar crisis impact that, right? Some observers like Titinan Ponsuderek, who will be speaking in a few weeks, have said that this is an existential threat to ASEAN. If ASEAN can't manage the Myanmar crisis, it's going to split apart, it lacks its utility. And for a country like the United States, particularly under a Biden administration, ASEAN is a key focal point, right? It's a good way to engage the region. Not having a strong ASEAN would complicate that. So could you speak on how, if at all, you envision a Cambodia's chairmanship of ASEAN and whether the Myanmar issue is an existential threat, and is Cambodia worried?
US-Cambodia relations, as a coordinating country for US Mekong, Cambodia has contributed significantly to the advancement of Mekong-US partnership. And the Lower Mekong Initiative, remember, Cambodia celebrated the most because Foreign Minister himself gave opening to the anniversary, 10 years anniversary of Lower Mekong Initiative, and Cambodia really pushed the US Mekong partnership, right? Cambodia chairmanship, okay, this year Cambodia is the chair of ASEAN. So coming to hedging again, it's a multilateralism. Over the past 3 years, Cambodia have been very vocal and proactive in promoting multilateralism. And the theme of ASEAN Summit, 53 leaders, head of state from Asia and Europe, on multilateralism for shared growth. So multilateralism is the main principal objective of Cambodia foreign policy. Next year, chairmanship of ASEAN, Cambodia will continue to advance this multilateralism, and of course to advance the relevance and the centrality of ASEAN, the external relation with major power, including the United States, very important. And I do share the view that Myanmar is the hot potato for Cambodia chair even next year. This year already is complex. It's very unfortunate. We have economic recovery post COVID-19 to solve. This is, and then the Myanmar crisis comes. So we waste resources, time and resources to think about Myanmar crisis. So that is very unfortunate. But I just would like to take this example. If the US and the West strongly reacted to Prayut Chan-o-cha military coup in Thailand, then perhaps that would send a signal to Myanmar military that not to have a coup in Myanmar. So perhaps the military leader Myanmar thought that the US and the West would not react as strong as we have seen so far, right? Because look at Thailand and look at the decline of democracy all over the world. You know, the American democracy in a mess, for instance. So the decision-making level at the Myanmar leader, perhaps they see all these developments and they make a move, you know, to maintain its power, power and economic interest. So so Cambodia, Prime Minister Hun Sen, if you read the recent op-ed and a Facebook comment by several ASEAN colleagues, that Hun Sen did not read the script at the Special ASEAN Summit. He talked to the ASEAN leader based on what his own perspective, and show that he really care about Myanmar, and he really strongly support the role of ASEAN in providing good offices and mediating role to resolve Myanmar political crisis. Of course, it must be accepted by all the party concerned in Myanmar. So that really show Hun Sen himself is very interested in offering any assistance as a chair of ASEAN next year to restore normalcy in Myanmar. And when he talked at the time, his eye always stick to the representative of the Myanmar military regime at the summit. So that I encourage you to read Kavi op-ed recently. Kavi wrote about it.
Yes.
So that is interesting. And Foreign Minister of Philippines also posted on his Facebook page after the meeting that it was the most a kind of candid dialogue among the ASEAN leaders. So Cambodia does care, and hopefully they can contribute more to the Myanmar issues. Thank you.
Okay, we are just about out of time. There was a question or two on vaccines, and maybe I could just very briefly, since Biden announced yesterday, right, that the United States would lift patents on the vaccines so that they can be distributed and other countries can produce them. I'm just curious, as I understand it, yes, China has provided a lot of PPE, face mask diplomacy, but I understand, or I believe I read, that Cambodia rejected certain Chinese vaccines. And if that's the case, I'd like to know why you think that was the case. And does the Biden administration's lifting of patents, does the Quad announcement that it would provide 200 million doses, we know that that's going to be difficult with the situation in India now. Do those things change perceptions at all in Cambodia?
In terms of perception, it's a bit mixed because of the community transmissions lately, February, March, now May, April and May, in the past several months, that caused by several Chinese citizens that escaped the quarantine facilities. That caused a kind of an up in terms of anti-China sentiments. But now perhaps things a bit have stabilized when it comes to a public perception toward China, with the support in terms of vaccines supply. I think now already nearly 2 million doses from Chinese government and company. And Cambodia is second after Singapore in terms of vaccination rollout across Southeast Asia. 16%, 17% of the total population now. It's about reached to nearly 2 million population vaccinated. So that's something that, you know, it's up and down in terms of anti-China perception in Cambodia. Like Sihanoukville a few years ago, you know, it's anti-China mainly caused by the development in Sihanoukville, the casino online gambling. But when the online gambling shut down, and then it subside, and now it's coming this kind of a spread of pandemic and so on. So again, when it comes to Cambodia-China relation, public opinion does matter. and the ruling elites need to also to manage the bilateral relation also with the consideration of the public opinion. Similarly to the anti-Vietnamese nationalism, so the ruling elite need to manage somehow this kind of delicate relationship in order to deal with the domestic public opinions. But when it comes to the US, the Cambodian public opinion quite positive, right? Quite positive toward the US. So that is a plus actually for the bilateral relationship. Thank you.
Okay. Does Kosal or Terith have any last words before?
I would give the last word to the Cambodians who asked a lot of questions, as it seems that their question have not been addressed. So if you have one more question, probably I would pick a Cambodian question from the question queue.
Okay, do you have one you want to answer, Kosal?
No, actually, I think allow them to the presenter to ask, because I think the question is for them. Really, I think there's a lot of good questions. Maybe we don't have time, perhaps. Maybe we can share this question with the presenter later on. I think they asked very good questions there.
They asked great questions, absolutely great questions, and a lot of commentary, both on the base, COVID-19, China. I mean, I was trying to get at some of them, the internal, external nexus. Yeah, they are fantastic questions out there. Unfortunately, I think we are just about out of time. I'm happy to stay, but I don't know if others are. Terith, did you have a last comment or anything?
Thanks, Professor. I think actually I have a lot to say too, but I think because we have a very limited time, so perhaps, yeah, I can exchange. I mean, I want to answer Dr. Kosal's question actually, but because we don't have time, I think I better communicate with him directly. Thank you, Professor.
Well, I think that what this just shows us, right? Sometimes people say if you do conferences on Cambodia, it's hard to generate an audience. I think that we proved that is not correct, right? There was not only a strong audience, there was an engaged audience, and it's all thanks to your great presentations and your commentary as well. I just want to announce that the next conference, next Friday, May 14th from 9 to 10:30, we're going to talk about the Philippines with a presentation by Renato de Castro entitled The Hedging Between Alliance or Appeasement. Can the Biden administration tip the balance in the Philippines hedging policy? So we're going to be talking a lot more about hedging. Greg Poling will be here for commentary. I want to thank Sreenith Pool behind the scenes for making this all happen, with Chanarith in Singapore, Terith in Canberra, Kosal and I here in the New York City area. I want to thank all of you for showing up tonight and asking great questions. What we will do is we will copy those and we will circulate those among ourselves, because this discussion is part of a larger project. There will be a roundtable and a book. So all of your comments and all of your feedback are going to be extremely useful to us. But most important, I have to thank our presenters tonight, Vannarith, Terith, and Kosal. You folks gave us such a broad historical sweep and sharp analytical analysis. It's very hard to get the two historical, analytical, all of Kosal's very penetrating theoretical questions. I feel like I was in a dissertation seminar, and I mean that in the absolute best way. So thank you all for coming. I look forward to our paths crossing, maybe virtually, but hopefully before too long in person. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.